May 1945, Hollywood director George Stevens and a few of his camera team are making fun of the Nazis. Adolf Hitler is dead and the Wehrmacht has finally been defeated. A bit of tomfoolery, perhaps to blot out memories of the horrors of Dachau.
Stevens is in no hurry to return to Hollywood. He is determined to document the end of the Nazi regime as accurately as possible. Consequently, he and his team have also come to Berchtesgaden. Stevens has been given permission to film on the Obersalzberg, Hitler's private refuge high above the town. The Berghof is a ruin, a symbol of the demise of a murderous ideology.
From the Obersalzberg, Stevens travelled to nearby Austria, first to Salzburg and then on to Innsbruck, sightseeing in a country which had willingly thrown itself into the arms of the Nazis. The small camera team also drove to the Brenner Pass, on the border with Italy and South Tyrol. The Wehrmacht had laid down its arms in Italy and southern Germany, but not in Austria as a whole, and the Reich government in Flensburg in northern Germany was still refusing to capitulate to the Soviet Union.
May the 6th, 1945. On behalf of Admiral Dönitz, Colonel General Alfred Jodl had flown to Reims in France to sign the declaration of the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. Kirkby Lawton, Eisenhower's man for photojournalism in World War II, documented this major event in world history with his amateur camera. Jodl still had hopes of securing a separate armistice with the Western Allies. Negotiations in the Allied headquarters were deadlocked for hours. Headed by General Eisenhower, the Allied delegation resolutely demanded the unconditional surrender of the German armed forces on all fronts. Jodl hesitated because this was a step he had no authority to take. The British and Americans responded by threatening to start bombing German cities again. To avoid annoying Stalin, a high-ranking Soviet liaison officer had been invited to attend the ceremony. It was only after midnight that the German delegation received a telegram from Dönitz saying that Jodl was allowed to sign.
At 2:39 a.m. on May the 7th, 1945, US General Walter Bedell Smith, Soviet General Ivan Suslaparov, and, as a witness, French Major General François Sevet all signed the capitulation document. Then it was Alfred Jodl's turn to add his signature. Then the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower, announced that as of 23:01 hours, Central European time, on May the 8th, 1945, the war would be over.
We, the undersigned, acting by authority of the German High Command, hereby surrender unconditionally to the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command, all forces on land, sea, and in the air who are at this date under German control.
When Joseph Stalin heard of the capitulation in Reims, he was beside himself with rage and demanded that the ceremony be repeated in his own sphere of influence. But the news from Reims had already been made public. As a result, most German soldiers surrendered voluntarily, if possible to the Americans. On May the 7th, a cameraman with Special Film Project 186 took these pictures somewhere in southeast Germany. In Tyrol on the evening of May the 7th, author Erich Kästner wrote in his diary,
Flensburg radio station has announced that Jodl has signed the capitulation document and that it will come into force tomorrow. But the radio station in Bohemia has called the report a fabrication concocted by the enemy. In Berlin, the Russians claim to have found the corpses of Goebbels, his wife, and their children. Now the radio stations have ceased broadcasting. It is quiet here. The only sound is that of cockchafers, those little armored insects flying headfirst into the illuminated window.
Meanwhile, Czech resistance fighters had restored the old borders which the Munich Agreement of 1938 had shifted in favor of the Sudeten German minority. Over the past 2 weeks, US General George S. Patton had advanced 30 to 40 kilometers a day, an almost incredible rate of progress. In early May 1945, his troops had crossed the border into Bohemia. On May the 6th, American units liberated the city of Pilsen. The next day, the GI's arrival turned into a rousing victory parade. Thousands of Pilsen citizens welcomed the Americans with boundless joy. It was the first time cameramen with Special Film Project 186 had been able to film scenes of jubilation.
Gone were people's fears that their hometown could still be turned into a battlefield. Yet that nearly happened, because in Pilsen and the surrounding area, the Germans still had around 15,000 troops who were determined to crush any attempts by the Czechs to revolt. However, the 2 US divisions which liberated Pilsen outnumbered the Germans. So the German commander, General von Majewski, decided to surrender. At 2:15 on the afternoon of May the 6th, 1945, he signed the capitulation document and ordered his troops to cease all hostilities. Then, in front of his staff and his wife, Majewski committed suicide. The American liberators remained in Pilsen for 7 months.
The occupying Germans left Pilsen forever. 6 years of brutal suppression had left their mark. In March 1939, Hitler's Wehrmacht had broken the Munich Agreement and marched into Czechoslovakia. As part of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, for years the people of Pilsen, too, were at the mercy of German despotism and terror. Around 3,000 Jewish citizens were deported to concentration camps.
Right up until Germany's capitulation, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner and his troops were entrenched in Bohemia. Schörner was a fanatical Nazi whom Hitler, in his last will and testament, had appointed commander-in-chief of the army. In line with the maxim, strength through fear, Schörner used brutal methods to put his troops under pressure. Deserters were hanged from the nearest tree with a sign round their necks saying, "I refuse to protect German women and children."
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels commented on this attitude as late as March 1945.
Such methods have an impact, of course. At any rate, every soldier in Schörner's combat area knows that he can die at the front and will die at the rear.
The German prisoners of war were escorted out of town by Czech resistance fighters. Things weren't always as amicable as these pictures taken by a US Air Force cameraman suggest. In places where, prior to the arrival of the Allies, a vacuum had formed, excessive violence was common. The aggressive mood was fueled by the Czech president in exile, Edvard Beneš, who, even before the war was over, had said,
"The Germans will be paid back many times over, and without mercy, for all the crimes they have committed in our land since 1938.
The Americans came across the victims of acts of vengeance time and again. It is May the 8th, 1945, the last day of the Second World War in Europe. The Czechs celebrated their American liberators, but they had nothing but contempt for their former tormentors. The bodies were carted away and buried somewhere. No one in Bohemia shed a single tear for a dead German.
The cameraman with Special Film Project 186 took these pictures right on the Soviet-American demarcation line. Before this Wehrmacht officer is allowed to pass the checkpoint, he has to hand over his pistol. A German general surrenders in comfort in a convertible. A US military policeman then drives him to a special prisoner of war camp for high-ranking officers.
Anyone who was fortunate enough grabbed a ride on a Wehrmacht truck heading for the safety of the West. Among the endless convoy of German soldiers, there were also some trucks carrying jubilant Czechs. At 12:30 on May the 8th, 1945, Reich President Karl Dönitz spoke to the nation on the radio.
Men and women of Germany, in my address on May the 1st, in which I informed you of the death of the Führer and my appointment as his successor, I stated that my first task was to save German lives. In order to attain this goal, in the night of the 6th to the 7th of May, I ordered the Armed Forces High Command to declare the unconditional surrender of all fighting troops in all theaters of war. At 2300 hours on May the 8th, the guns will fall silent.
Most of the defeated German soldiers had to make their way into captivity on foot. This is how one soldier remembered May the 8th, 1945.
We were really frightened. All we could think about was what awaited us over the next few days. What would happen to us in Czechoslovakia, surrounded as we were with no way out? Then suddenly the war was over. The new Führer of what was left of the Reich, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, announced the unconditional surrender of the Reich and the Wehrmacht. At long last the war was over. Years of destroying human lives and property were over. But what would become of us Germans now? My life had been preserved, but how would I be able to shape it? Would there be any real possibilities open to me?
On May the 8th, US President Harry S. Truman addressed his nation on the radio.
This is a solemn but a glorious hour. Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band.
The rats were leaving the sinking ship. On May the 8th, 1945, in Kitzingen near Würzburg, a German war hero allowed himself to be filmed by a cameraman with Special Film Project 186. Together with his squadron, fighter and bomber pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel had flown out of Bohemia to surrender to the Americans. Rudel was the only member of the German armed forces to be awarded the Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords and diamonds. He was also a fanatical Nazi. In March 1945, while still in a military hospital after being seriously wounded by Soviet anti-aircraft fire, Rudel appeared on Joseph Goebbels' weekly propaganda newsreel, exhorting the Germans to stand firm.
This time it is not about personal sacrifices. We all need to grit our teeth and willingly accept these sacrifices. And in the end, this nation of ours, which up to now has fought so courageously and has indeed gritted its teeth, will achieve final victory.
Rudel presented himself to his American hosts as a cultivated individual who, as a soldier, had merely been doing his duty. Rudel spent nearly a year in American captivity. After he was released, he first set up a haulage company. But in 1948, he fled via the Rat Line to South America. In Argentina, Rudel set up a relief organization for Nazi war criminals and maintained close contact with fascists from Italy and Croatia who were being searched for worldwide. Rudel ended the war as an amputee, but still firmly convinced that National Socialism had been a good idea.
In this respect, he was totally in agreement with Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, who, like Rudel, was a highly decorated fighter pilot. After his release from American captivity, Galland also went to Argentina, where he acted as advisor to President Juan Perón's Air Force. When Perón was ousted from power, Adolf Galland returned to Germany, while Hans-Ulrich Rudel served the dictators of Paraguay and Chile. In Chile, he occasionally resided in the notorious Colonia Dignidad torture commune. For the rest of his life, Rudel maintained close contact with the neo-Nazi scene in Germany. The funeral of the Nazi war hero in 1982 turned into a macabre showpiece. Old comrades bade farewell with the Hitler salute. German Air Force jets made a low-level pass over the cemetery, and the mourners sang all three verses of the German national anthem.
In London on May the 8th, people gathered in the streets to celebrate the end of the Second World War in Europe. In his memoirs, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote,
"The unconditional surrender of our enemies was the signal for the greatest outburst of joy in the history of mankind. The Second World War had indeed been fought to the bitter end in Europe. The vanquished as well as the victors felt inexpressible relief. Weary and worn, impoverished but undaunted, and now triumphant, we had a moment that was sublime. We thanked God for the greatest of his blessings, the feeling that we had done our duty."
On May the 8th, Churchill insisted on giving the Victory in Europe broadcast himself. It was almost 5 years to the day, on May the 10th, 1940, he had assumed leadership of a national coalition government in Britain's darkest hour. Following defeat in France and the retreat from Dunkirk, Churchill predicted that the war against Nazi Germany would cost his people blood, sweat and tears. His contempt for Hitler knew no bounds. Consequently, VE Day was the biggest triumph of his life.
As Churchill drove through London, the crowds cheered him. But barely 2 months later, he suffered a bitter defeat at the hands of the British electorate. It cost Churchill the office of Prime Minister. Walking behind the Sergeant-at-Arms, who is bearing the ceremonial mace of the House of Commons, Speaker Douglas Clifton heads for Westminster Abbey, followed by the Prime Minister and His Majesty's government. In the Abbey, the congregation sang the hymn of thanksgiving written by Isaac Watts in 1708.
O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home.
The first to leave the Abbey after the service was the royal family. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, and their daughters, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. Plans had been put forward for the royal family to be evacuated to Canada. But first and foremost, it was the Queen who totally rejected the idea.
The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave.
The king and queen remained in London throughout the war, actively giving comfort and encouragement to people, especially during the Blitz.
May the 9th, 1945. At a barracks in Wiesbaden, liberated Soviet slave workers celebrate victory over Germany. Most of them had been deported to the Third Reich after the Nazis occupied the Ukraine and Belarus. The women were put to work mainly in armaments factories. For all Soviet citizens, the 9th of May was the day of liberation from Nazi fascism. That is because the Declaration of Surrender was signed after midnight, Moscow time. Joseph Stalin had demanded that the capitulation ceremony be repeated in Berlin-Karlshorst. In his view, the pictures from Reims in which the Soviet general seemed like a mere observer, could not symbolize the end of a war that had cost the lives of 27 million of his subjects. On May the 9th, a camera team with Special Film Projects 186 took this footage of the victory celebrations in Wiesbaden, at which a statement by the Soviet dictator was read out.
3 years ago, Hitler declared for all to hear that his aims included the dismemberment of the Soviet Union and the wresting from it of the Caucasus, the Ukraine, Byelorussia, the Baltic Islands, and other areas. He declared bluntly, "We will destroy Russia so that she will never be able to rise again." This was 3 years ago. However, Hitler's crazy ideas were not fated to come true. The progress of the war scattered them to the winds. In actual fact, the direct opposite of the Hitlerese ravings has taken place. Germany is utterly defeated. The German troops are surrendering. The Soviet Union is celebrating victory, although it does not intend either to dismember or to destroy Germany.
On May the 9th, 1945, 2 US Air Force cameramen took this footage on a road somewhere on Germany's border with Czechoslovakia. To escape the Red Army, Wehrmacht remnants were fleeing to that part of Germany occupied by the Americans. Their supreme commander, Field Marshal Friedrich Schörner, had long since left his troops in the lurch and absconded. On May the 9th, dressed in civilian clothes and with several thousand marks from government coffers in his possession, he had flown in a Fieseler Storch to Austria, where a short time later he was arrested by the Americans.
Members of the SS, who in the last weeks of the war had stood out through particularly fanatical resistance, had intermingled with ordinary German soldiers. Heinrich Himmler's henchmen obviously felt safe in the midst of a stream of soldiers, nurses, and civilian employees flooding back to Germany. These child soldiers have also survived. Some Germans were immaculately dressed when they surrendered to the Americans.
Exuding self-confidence, this lieutenant colonel with the Waffen-SS presented himself to the Americans as an adversary on an equal footing. But the GIs were not impressed. They knew all about the atrocities the SS had committed against captured US troops in the Ardennes. In the eyes of the 2 cameramen with Special Film Project 186, this officer was obviously a perfect example of the German master race.
On the other side of the border, in the small village of Tannenbergstal in the Vogtland region, convoys of German troops who had surrendered to the Americans were gridlocked. Just as the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht had demanded, the soldiers laid down their arms in a sorted and orderly fashion. On May the 9th, 1945, around 10 million Germans laid down their arms, the relics of a war which their Supreme Commander, Adolf Hitler, had long planned and which, worldwide, had claimed around 60 million lives.
Not a single high-ranking Wehrmacht officer felt the need to ignore Hitler's insane orders and prevent the slaughter of the last few weeks of the war. Even after the Führer had committed suicide, the fighting still continued. Thus, in the final week of the Second World War, 95,000 German soldiers met a senseless end. In the chaos of unconditional surrender, many an ordinary soldier tried to abscond unrecognized. In Tyrol on May 10, 1945, Erich Kästner described scenes in his diary that occurred in so many places.
The procession of limping soldiers is endless. They sell cigarettes to get their hands on a bit of money. There is a permanent demand for civilian clothes. But there is nothing to be had. Wardrobes are empty. A neighbor was given 450 cigarettes for an old pair of trousers. I'd love to make that kind of deal. But the only trousers I've got are the ones I'm wearing. Some lance corporal offered the Steiners 3 pounds of smoked sausage, 20 cigarettes and 100 marks in cash for a civilian suit. But the deal didn't go through. Herr Steiner thought the price didn't reflect the tense market situation. The Steiners had lost 2 sons in the war. When a bystander pointed out that their suits could be sold, the mood turned ugly. But the old man swallowed his anger and slammed the door.
May 14, 1945, a week after Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender, a camera team with Special Film Project 186 was filming in Augsburg. By now, people here too had resigned themselves to the fact that the Nazi Reich was gone and were coming to terms with their new masters. The city had surrendered peacefully to the Americans on April 28, 1945. The people of Augsburg were relieved that the war had come to an end in their city without bloodshed. One inhabitant remembered later,
"You had this double feeling of being defeated yet at the same time liberated. Defeat had to come. You could almost touch it. But only very slowly did we realize what being liberated really meant." In an entry in her diary on May 8, 1945, another inhabitant of Augsburg wrote,
"What a beautiful day! Nature is fresh and young. The sun is shining and the sky is blue. You would think that a day like this would be full of jubilation and sound, that people would be laughing and weeping for joy, and that the bells would be ringing, because today the word peace is on everyone's lips. Peace in our land. Something we almost dreamt of for 6 long years of war."
The people of Augsburg were going to work or taking a walk as if there had never been any enthusiasm for Hitler or any war crimes.
But the victors had their doubts about the seemingly unpolitical attitude of the Germans. They asked awkward questions. Who had been a member of the Nazi Party? Who had stood by as Hitler's crimes were committed? And who bore personal guilt? General Eisenhower's Proclamation No. 1 stated,
"We come as conquerors but not as oppressors. We shall obliterate Nazism and German militarism. We shall overthrow the Nazi rule, dissolve the Nazi Party, and abolish the cruel, oppressive and discriminatory laws and institutions which the party has created."
The Americans had precise ideas on how the Germans were to organize their future. The US occupying forces came with well-prepared plans for the structure of administrative bodies, political parties, and cultural life in this new freedom, with everything based on the model of Western democracies. At first, many Germans had their doubts about this concept. People preferred to focus more on their everyday lives than on reappraising their country's Nazi past. Many suppressed the guilt issue. Ultimately, hundreds of thousands of denazification tribunals took place. The aim was to determine whether the person summoned was to be classified as a major offender, lesser offender, follower, or exonerated person. Roughly 2/3 of those interrogated were classified as followers or were exonerated.
At the end of the war, the victors focused first and foremost on the ruling elite of the Third Reich. In Augsburg, on May 14, 1945, the US Air Force team also took this footage of the most important representative of the Nazi regime who was still alive, Hermann Göring. Here, the 52-year-old approaches the camera with a smile on his face. The dazzling Reichsmarschall had long been Hitler's deputy, but just before the end of the war, the Nazi leader had removed Göring from all his positions. Firmly convinced that he would become the Führer's successor, Göring had surrendered to the Americans and been taken to the US interrogation center in Augsburg. After his arrest, Göring is said to have claimed that war was like a football match. At the end, the loser shakes the winner's hand and all is forgotten.
With charm and cunning, the prominent prisoner obviously wanted to evade responsibility. Following an improvised press conference, author Klaus Mann, who was working in defeated Germany as an American reporter, had this to say about Göring.
You can't even say that he looked particularly unsympathetic. Rather the opposite, in fact. Admittedly, his face did display a certain brutality. And there was often a really evil glint in his eye. His overall appearance was that of a condottieri, someone who, despite all the cruelty he exuded, still had a touch of joviality about him.
Had I known what was happening in the concentration camps, Göring claimed, I would have taken vigorous action. Like most Germans, Göring too saw no need to account for the past.
The victors took a different view. Göring was one of the main war criminals to stand trial in Nuremberg in October 1946 and was sentenced to death. But hours before his execution, he swallowed a cyanide capsule and took his own life. The main thing, he is said to have commented, is that for 12 years I had a good life.
June 1945. Hollywood director George Stevens and his camera team are on their way to Hamburg. Stevens would rather have been heading for Berlin, but Western reporters were not yet allowed into the German capital, which was in Soviet hands. Stevens had been waiting for special permission ever since Germany's unconditional capitulation. In the meantime, it had become clear that on July the 1st, the Allies would be able to occupy their sectors in Berlin. Only then would Stevens also be allowed to visit the German capital. On arrival in Hamburg, Stevens and his team first went to the city's world-famous port to do some filming. The Kehrwiederspitze was still largely intact, but around 80% of the port area had been destroyed in bombing raids. Vast amounts of rubble and numerous wrecks had made the navigation channels impassable. Curious, a few children approached the American camera team and let themselves be filmed. The Hafenstraße with the old Elbe tunnel.
In 1943, that Hamburg became the target of devastating bombing raids, which also completely destroyed the city center. Fortunately, the war came to an end here without hostilities. Hitler had declared Hamburg a fortress to be defended to the last bullet. But the city's military leaders ignored the order to destroy its vital port installations. On May 3, 1945, Hamburg was peacefully handed over to the British.
Stevens toured the wasteland in his Jeep. In Operation Gomorrah, which the Allies mounted in late July 1943, hundreds of thousands of incendiaries caused firestorms of untold ferocity, which claimed 34,000 lives. Author Hans-Erich Nossack wrote about the wholesale destruction of his hometown.
Someone might think that it is hard to stand where you had lived for many years, and where there is now nothing, that you would perhaps sigh or sob. But it is not hard, simply incomprehensible. So incomprehensible that you cannot weigh it. Indeed, that weight is so appallingly heavy, it is almost impossible to describe.
Having a roof over their head, a home, and enough food to keep their families alive was the very minimum of security that people in occupied Germany now wished for. In early July 1945, George Stevens and his team were at last allowed to leave Hamburg. Driving over the Elbe bridges, they headed for Berlin. The men still had enough rolls of 16mm colour film to document Hitler's capital and the conference of the Big Three, Stalin, Truman, and Churchill, in Potsdam. Berlin, early July 1945. Since the end of the housing war in Hitler's center of power, the Soviet authorities have determined the future of the city. 2 months after the end of the war, the British and Americans are allowed to move into their agreed sectors. A camera crew of Hollywood director George Stevens ventures into the Soviet-occupied part of the city at the Brandenburg Gate. At Pariser Platz, the men first film the badly damaged Hotel Adlon. Before the war, one of the most fashionable abodes in Berlin, it was a military hospital during the battle for the capital. Shortly after the surrender, the building caught fire and has been uninhabitable ever since. Just around the corner, unter den Linden, a ruin is collapsing.
At the Brandenburg Gate, George Stevens poses in his Jeep, just as he's used to doing in the Dream Factory. He would have loved to have been there with his cameras at Hitler's downfall, but Allied reporters are not allowed to enter Berlin until July to document the lives of the defeated after 12 years of Nazi rule and 6 years of war.
Berlin's former boulevard is now passable again. Bicycles are a luxury as a means of transport. Debris is being removed and tidied up everywhere. The last weeks of the war, the bombing raids, the excesses of the Soviet conquerors seem almost forgotten. It's not yet clear how things will continue. In a little over a week, the victorious powers will discuss this in Potsdam.
Moscow, the 24th of June 1945. 6 weeks after the German surrender, the Soviet Union celebrates its victory over the fascist beast. Here, before the walls of the Holy Kremlin, the country greets its sons who have returned from victory, heroes of unprecedented battles on all fronts of the patriotic war. From Lenin's mausoleum, Joseph Stalin receives the homage of his subjects and oversees the Red Army's grand parade in Red Square. For 4 years, the Generalissimo demanded everything of his people to drive the German invaders out of the country. The Soviet Union suffered 27 million casualties in the Great Patriotic War. The Red Army celebrates itself and its victory over Hitler. The symbols of Nazi rule are thrown on the ground in front of the Red Dictator in camera-ready fashion. Stalin is at the height of his power. With the help of the Red Army, he will consolidate the Soviet Union's status as a superpower.
July 1945, a flight over a desert of rubble. 50,000 tons of explosives fell on Berlin during the war. Of the buildings in the German capital, 48,000 are destroyed, 23,000 severely damaged, and 172,000 slightly damaged. After visiting the destroyed German capital, British Air Force Marshal Arthur Tedder described it this way.
Berlin as a city is completely destroyed. The ruins of what was once Berlin should be preserved as a modern Babylon or Carthage, a monument to Prussian militarism and the horrors of the Nazi regime. The city is completely dead. You drive kilometer after kilometer through abandoned ruins and find nothing habitable. Berlin can never be rebuilt.
The New York Times in the summer of 1945 hopes that the obliteration of Berlin could herald the beginning of a renewed civilization of Germany, and a visitor believes that very few people would regret the disappearance of this unlovable parvenu among European capitals. The American journalist William Shearer describes Berlin in his diary.
How shall one find words to portray truthfully and accurately the picture of a great capital destroyed beyond recognition? The image of a once powerful nation that has ceased to exist. The image of a conquering people who only 5 years ago, when I left here, behaved in such a brutally arrogant manner and were blindly convinced of their mission as a master race. In this pile of rubble, there are also Berliners with confidence. Journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes in her diary on the 7th of July 1945,
"The whole city lives in a frenzy of expectation. One wants to tear oneself apart with eagerness to work, to have 1,000 hands and 1,000 brains. The Americans are here, the English, the Russians. The French too are said to be in the offing. Maybe they've already moved into their occupation area. We don't know all that for sure. Rumours abound, are defended and refuted. It doesn't matter at all. All that matters is that we are at the centre of the activity."
2.8 million people live in Berlin. Rubble women dominate the cityscape. They take stone after stone out of the mountains of rubble for reconstruction. Clean-up work that will take years, and most of the men have been killed or are imprisoned.
In Berlin at this time, cameramen from Special Film Project 186 are also on the move. On the 9th of July 1945, Captain Carter shoots this footage of Berlin women and children who are apparently being adequately cared for. Refugees from the East, on the other hand, have a particularly hard time. US reporter William Shearer.
Starving human beings with no will, purpose in life or goal, reduced to animalistic functions like finding food and shelter to get through the next day alive.
Rations are meagre. The best off are heavy workers and workers in unhealthy factories. This also includes cultural and artistic workers. Then come the categories for blue and white collar workers, rubble women and children. Those who do not work only receive ration card number 5 for non-working family members and the rest of the population. In the vernacular, it is called the hunger or cemetery card.
Captain Carter's real job is to document the bomb damage in the capital. On this 9th of July, he's particularly interested in historic buildings that played a special role in the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. The Kaiserhof Hotel on Wilhelmsplatz was the first luxury hotel in Imperial Berlin. In the 1920s, the operators sympathized with right-wing nationalist circles. From 1932, Hitler lived exclusively in this hotel when he visited Berlin. From his suite, he planned the takeover of Germany. On the 30th of January 1933, he traveled from here to President Hindenburg, who appointed him Reich Chancellor.
The Kaiserhof is just as much a ruin as the Berlin Sports Palace on Potsdamer Straße. It was here that Hitler gave his first major speech as head of government in February 1933, announcing the crushing of the Communist Party and declaring his anti-Semitic inflammatory slogans to be state doctrine. 10 years later, on the 18th of February 1943, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels shouted, "Do you want total war?" into the arena. 15,000 fanatical party comrades cheered him and chanted previously rehearsed slogans.
It took only 2 years for total war to finally reach Berlin. Hitler's Reich Chancellery was also badly damaged in a heavy bombing raid in February 1945. Soviet artillery did the rest. On the 1st of May, Reich Chancellor Joseph Goebbels committed suicide here, clearing the way for the unconditional surrender of the capital. Red Army soldiers immortalized themselves on the sign with vulgar slogans. The fate of Adolf Hitler remains unclear on this 9th of July 1945. German propaganda had declared that the Führer was killed in action fighting for Germany against Bolshevism to his last breath. But this is a bold-faced lie. In the bunker under the garden of the Reich Chancellery, the dictator shot himself in the head on the 30th of April.
His last loyal followers carried the body to this bunker exit and doused it with petrol. Former security officers will soon testify that they watched the burning from a watchtower. They say that the charred remains of Hitler and his wife Eva were then buried in a bomb crater. But what happened to the bodies? As early as the 5th of May 1945, Soviet Secret Service agents found the grave. Within a short time, Hitler could be identified by his teeth. Joseph Stalin was informed, but the Kremlin ruler keeps the news to himself because he wants to keep his Western allies in the dark.
With heavy losses, the Red Army has captured Hitler's power center. On this 9th of July 1945, another US Air Force cameraman meticulously documents the bullet holes in Albert Speer's monumental architecture, which for 6 years symbolized the German delusion of invincibility. The Red Army put a bloody end to this hubris.
Throughout conquered Berlin, the Soviet victors put up posters with mottos by Joseph Stalin.
The strength of the Red Army consists in the fact that it does not and cannot harbor racial hatred against other peoples, not even against the German people, as it is educated in the spirit of equality of all peoples and races, in the spirit of respect for the rights of other peoples. Such words are sheer mockery even for opponents of the Nazis, in view of looting and countless rapes in the first weeks after the surrender. Journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes in her diary,
"How little do trained politicians understand the simple trick that you only win peoples if you offer them better than before. The crowd hails the liberator, the savior from evil. Because they added to their misery, the inhabitants of the East Zone hate the Russians today. The Americans will do it differently, the English too. They will correct the psychological blunders of the first occupying power and restore justice and trust."
A symbol of hope is the almost intact victory column, affectionately called the Goldelse by Berliners. It stands beyond the Brandenburg Gate in the British sector of Berlin, where the Union Jack has been flying since the 1st of July.
Hollywood director George Stevens also took his camera crew to Wilhelmstrasse to visit Hitler's Reich Chancellery. After the so-called Anschluss of Austria and the victory over France, the Germans cheered their Führer here. Now most of them don't want to hear about it anymore. These men are glad that they survived the war and were not taken to the Soviet Union. George Stevens has special permission from the Soviet occupation authorities to also visit and film inside the building. State guests were once received in the Cour d'honneur. Albert Speer went all out for crude effects.
When the diplomats see this, they will learn to fear it, Hitler said to have once said to his architect. The Hollywood director is also interested in the dictator's whereabouts. That the body was burned here in the garden is only a rumor at this point. What is certain is that Josef Goebbels and his wife Magda took their own lives here. Their charred bodies were also recovered here by the Soviet Secret Service. But in this case, Stalin's propaganda had already informed the world public about the find.
George Stevens drives with his team to the sites from the Germans' imperial past. At the National Monument to Kaiser Wilhelm I, the American reporters meet a group of Red Army soldiers. The Soviets have already made a German prisoner of war flown in from Moscow, the police chief of Berlin, in May. And, thanks to the anti-fascist attitude of Paul Markgraf, control the newly established police units. One of the tasks is to combat black market trafficking. Directly at the Brandenburg Gate is the largest black market in occupied Berlin. The place is ideal for illegal business because the Tiergarten is nearby and the Soviet sector begins only a few meters away. Many Berliners sell their last belongings that survived the bombing war for food. Officially, the Allied authorities disapprove of the barter trade and occasionally try to crack down on it with raids. The Western Allies are suspicious of the Markgraf police from the start, rightly suspecting that the men are the extended arm of communist functionaries who have already arrived in Berlin from Soviet exile in early May. The Communist Party of Germany, banned by the Nazis, was already readmitted by the Soviets on the 11th of June 1945.
Most Berliners still don't care. They're not interested in the slowly emerging conflict between the victorious powers, but in the daily struggle for survival. On the 10th of July 1945, Captain Carter of Special Film Project 186 shoots this scene of rebel women clearing mountains of rubble for 72 pfennigs an hour and a better ration card. Every brick that is still halfway usable will be the basis of new housing for Berlin's population, which is overwhelmingly made up of women and children. On this 10th of July 1945, the journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich reflects in her diary on the political future of Germany.
Perhaps part of our misfortune is due to the fact that we have too few personalities. Each nation is naturally endowed with about the same percentage, 10% leaders against 90% led. That is to say, among 60 million Germans, about 6 million of all classes who think independently, act independently, judge independently, against 54 million who are indifferent, immature, and basically followers. After the last 25 years, what has remained of this precious 10%?
Cameraman Carter's notes say that this boy's parents are dead and the 9-year-old is searching for his big brother. Endless refugee tracks pass through the ruined city. Hundreds of thousands of people who have come from the east with their few possessions. Because Berlin is already overcrowded, most of them have to move on. Those who live in Berlin have to improvise every day. Water is a precious commodity. The supply is still provided by public pumps. But some of the groundwater is contaminated and carries the risk of contracting dysentery or typhus. Even the obviously better off show up in the streets and stroll through Berlin in pretty summer dresses, looking for work, barter goods or a flat. Many of the undestroyed houses and villas in the suburbs of Dahlem, Zehlendorf or Charlottenburg have been requisitioned by the British and Americans to house the occupying troops. Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes in her diary,
Our soldiers have also seized quarters in Russia and France. Only that one obviously feels something like this much more bitterly when it happens to oneself. Evacuation within a few hours. Barely the most necessary things allowed to be taken away. When the flat door clicks shut behind the evacuees, they can consider themselves totally bombed out. And as with the totally bombed out, the unfortunates fall without distinction of person. Whether Nazi opponent or Nazi friend, rich or poor, whoever has to get out has to get out. Let him then see where he can find a place to live.
Those who were bombed out during the last years of the war know this situation. On the ruins you can still see the inscriptions with new addresses for relatives or friends. Many flats have bomb damage but are still usable. If the facade is missing, family life takes place in front of the public. At night, people have to be careful not to fall in the dark. Entire streets, on the other hand, are uninhabitable. On this 10th of July 1945, Captain Carter shoots a tracking shot for the US Air Force. The green of the street trees will not remain for long. Most of them are already cut down in autumn, as fuel for the winter.
Although most of the streets have been cleared, There is almost no traffic in the former metropolis. Only a few private vehicles are registered. Most of the wide cars were confiscated by the Wehrmacht or later by the victors, and so people wait patiently for the few means of public transport, like here at Alexanderplatz in the Soviet sector, where there are regular tram connections to the outer districts again. Even an S-Bahn line has been back in service since the beginning of July.
George Stevens has gone to the Reichssportfeld, where Nazi Germany was allowed to host the 1936 Summer Olympics. At first, the USA wanted to boycott the event. But when the regime agreed to allow Jewish athletes to compete, American officials relented. Jesse Owens, a black athlete with 4 gold medals, became the superstar of the Games, much to the chagrin of the Führer. Not only in the USA, but also in Germany, many people had hoped that the Olympic Games would strengthen the dictator's will for peace. But this soon proved to be a naive illusion. The site has been in the British sector since the arrival of the Western Allies. The new masters immediately put the Olympic swimming stadium back into operation for their soldiers. For Germans, of course, swimming is off limits.
George Stevens and his team also take a trip to the Wannsee, where only a few bathers are enjoying themselves in July 1945. They are occupation soldiers and their female companions who demonstratively ignore the ban on fraternization. The relationship between the soldiers of the victorious powers still seems to be unclouded here. The interest in the German Fräuleins unites them. Germans are not allowed to enter the beach, but they're only too happy to make an exception for attractive young ladies. There is even a golf course at the beach club of the 2nd U.S. Armored Division, the Hell on Wheels. Under the command of General George S. Patton, the unit has fought its way from Normandy through the Ardennes to Germany and is now stationed in the American sector of Berlin.
German policemen have cleared the square at the Brandenburg Gate for a large parade by the British. The men are wearing uniforms that were in service before 1933. Especially in the Soviet sector, the police are not too particular about their past. Men trained under the Nazis are also loyally at the service of the new masters. On this 12th of July 1945, soldiers of the British Desert Rats march across Hitler's east-west axis to the Brandenburg Gate. The cameramen of Special Film Project 186 are on site to film the special spectacle. The 7th British Armoured Division distinguished itself above all in the battles of the African Campaign, liberating Tripoli and Tunis in 1943. It crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and took part in the occupation of Hamburg. The border between the British and Soviet sectors runs right here. So this square is the ideal place to celebrate the joint victory over Nazi Germany. But Berliners sense very clearly that cracks are appearing in the Allied Brotherhood in arms. Journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich writes in her diary,
"They don't seem to love each other, our Allied occupying forces. One must not let this become loud. If we cautiously hint to the Americans and English that there might have been difficulties with the Russian occupation, their countenances turn cold as ice."
Field Marshal Bernard L. Montgomery, the Commander-in-Chief of the British occupation forces, has arrived from his headquarters in East Westphalia to present the victor of Berlin with a High British Order of Merit. Marshal Georgi Zhukov. Joint appearances like this are intended to deceive the public about the true state of relations between the Allies.
Hollywood director George Stevens has also come to Berlin with his team to document the forthcoming Conference of the Victors. Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin had last met in Yalta. After the death of the US President, Harry S. Truman has become his successor. The Big Three are meeting in Potsdam to discuss the future of Germany. Although Truman sees with concern that the Red Army controls almost all of Eastern Europe, he still believes in a future for the anti-Hitler coalition with the Soviet Union.
In the British sector, George Stevens films a Red Army unit marching through the Tiergarten. His president expresses the belief these days that the Russians would continue to be friends of the US. Although incidents between GIs and Red Army soldiers continue to occur in Berlin, Truman sees no reason at this point not to welcome their friendship and give them ours.
July the 14th, 1945, Captain Carter of Special Film Project 186 shoots this footage at Pariser Platz, which is part of the Soviet sector. What will be the future of a destroyed, defeated and occupied Germany? Will the Soviet Union sooner or later extend its influence further west? Is Joseph Stalin counting on the withdrawal of American troops from Europe, as Roosevelt had announced at Yalta? Or will the British, Americans and French stick to their plan to rebuild the country and educate the Germans to become democrats? After all, the president never really took seriously US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau's idea of making Germany an agricultural country without heavy industry. Morgenthau's adversary, US Secretary of War Henry Stimson, won Truman over with the view that the only hope for a stable future in Europe was an economically strong and productive Germany. In his diary, he writes about a conversation with Truman in mid-May 1945.
Punish the war criminals severely. Take away the weapons for all time. Supervise government action until the Nazi-educated generation has left the stage. But don't deprive them of the possibility of building a contented Germany at the end, interested only in the non-military methods of civilization. This is exactly what Ruth Andreas Friedrich hopes for.
That 4 world powers will meet in our ruins, and that we will prove to the representatives of these world powers how serious we are about our zeal, How boundlessly serious about the effort to make amends and rise. Berlin is running at full speed. If we are understood and forgiven now, everything will be achieved from us. Everything. That we renounce Nazism, that we find the new better, that we work and are fundamentally of goodwill. Never before have we been so ripe for redemption, so tired of terror, fear, and injustice. If only our victors will keep their promises to us.
Tempelhof Airport was one of the first major projects of the Third Reich. When it was inaugurated in 1941, the monumental facility was considered the largest surface building in the world. However, when the US Air Force took over the site on the 2nd of July 1945, the cleanup work was not complete. So on the afternoon of the 15th of July 1945, 3 C-54 transport planes land at the British military airfield in Gatow. On board, they have the American delegation that the US president is taking to the Potsdam Conference. It is 4 times the size of the delegation that had traveled to Yalta in February. The notorious prosecutor of the Stalinist show trials, Andrei Vyshinsky, and Soviet ambassador Andrei Gromyko greet US Secretary of State James Burns.
Various generals and liaison officers accompany the president, plus Secret Service security guards, naval cooks and military doctors to ensure Truman's well-being. US General George Marshall is one of the advocates of rapid reconstruction with American help. He will initiate the Marshall Plan for Europe, named after him, in 1948. Then Truman also leaves his plane. In a letter to his mother and sister before leaving Washington, he had written,
I have a briefcase full of information about previous conferences and suggestions as to what I should do and say. I wish I didn't have to go there.
Potsdam has been sealed off by Soviet checkpoints for days. In front of the villa of a German publisher in Babelsberg called Little White House, President Truman receives the British Prime Minister on the morning of the 16th of July 1945. These scenes are filmed by Kirk B. Lawton, who is part of the American delegation. Winston Churchill is a head of government on call because he lost the House of Commons elections on the 5th of July. He believes Truman cannot hold a candle to his late predecessor, but he's impressed from the outset by the president's tremendous resolve. Truman is apparently less enthusiastic, as his diary reveals.
He told me a lot of nonsense about how great my country was, how much he loved Roosevelt, and how he would love me. I think we can get along if he doesn't butter me up too much. George Stevens drives with his team along the Autobahn to Potsdam. On the way, he films Berliners who have apparently procured food in the surrounding countryside. In her diary, Ruth Andreas Friedrich hopes for positive news.
It was announced on the radio this evening that Stalin, Truman and Churchill had arrived for a joint conference. What has happened up to now we have to accept as the aftermath of war, including the rapes, the looting and confiscations. The meeting of the Big Three will establish order. It will prepare the ground for good to flourish.
George Stevens' camera crew is filming in the old garrison city of the Prussian kings, now in the Soviet occupation zone. Stalin has refused to enter Berlin. Graves of Soviet soldiers testify to the fact that Potsdam was not vacated by the Wehrmacht without a fight. Because of the stage guests, the Red Army marches through the city more frequently. This brings back bad memories, especially for many women. A Potsdam woman later writes about the 8th of May 1945.
How we had longed for this end, but had we now reached a state we could call peace? We had not imagined the Soviet occupation to be as bad as it now appeared. Now what we had sometimes said in jest during the last months of the war had become reality. Enjoy the war, peace will be terrible.
Although Potsdam was badly hit in an American bombing raid in the spring of 1945, in Stalin's eyes it was suitable for the big conference. It is in Soviet-occupied territory and can be better protected than Berlin. The magnificent buildings from the Prussian era, such as the Nikolaikirche by Karl Friedrich Schinkel, are also damaged. The decision of the upcoming conference will shape the lives of Germans for decades.
Media representatives from all over Europe have arrived to cover the major event. Stevens' team proudly presents the Russian pass for the car. The Hollywood director has an accreditation for the big event. Whether he was finally allowed to shoot there in black and white is unclear. So these scenes remain George Stevens' last colour shots before his return to America.
The 17th of July 1945. Before the start of the conference, Stalin pays his respects to the American president. Kirk B. Lawton shoots with his amateur camera. Truman will later describe the most powerful man in the world as friendly, good-natured, and businesslike, as honest and insanely smart. At the meeting, US Secretary of State Burns casually asks the Soviet dictator if he knows anything about Hitler's whereabouts. Stalin claims Hitler is still alive and hiding in Spain or Argentina.
The venue for the Potsdam Conference is Cecilienhof Palace, where the German Crown Prince and his family resided before 1918. Lawton is allowed to film from the gallery. A Russian camera crew, on the other hand, shoots in 35mm colour. Officially, the Soviet Union is still neutral towards Japan, and so the first topic at the negotiating table is the Pacific War. Stalin has already signalled to Truman during the morning conversation that he will soon declare war on Japan. Then Stalin, Truman and Churchill discuss the drawing of borders in post-war Europe, reparation payments and the administration of occupied Germany. Press meeting of the Big Three on the terrace. Truman is in high spirits because he has got his hands on a military instrument with threatening potential just in time for the start of the conference. On a military base in New Mexico, the first nuclear weapons test in history has succeeded. A new era has begun that will soon be called the Cold War.
Special Film Project 186 finishes its month-long work in Germany with aerial footage of destroyed Berlin. About 80 hours of footage have been shot. The unique material will disappear for decades in a US Air Force depot. There is no money to edit a documentary film from it. In Potsdam, the victors agree that Germany will not be partitioned. The West accepts Stalin's demand for the separation of East Prussia and the areas east of the Oder and Neisse rivers. The country is to be completely disarmed and demilitarized. The Germans must pay reparations. War criminals are to be trialed by an international military tribunal. Ruth Andreas Friedrich is optimistic.
Big headlines in the newspapers. The Potsdam Agreement, common policy in all occupation zones, agreement on the peace order in Europe. It took a load off our minds, so no new war. Common construction and common order. The final communiqué emphasizes the statesmen leave the conference with the renewed confidence that the governments and peoples of their countries, in conjunction with the other United Nations, will ensure the establishment of a just and lasting peace. It sounds almost too good to be true. The American president is not quite so confident. At the sight of the destruction in Berlin, Truman was utterly shocked. On the 16th of July 1945, he wrote in his diary,
I thought of Carthage, Baalbek, Jerusalem, Rome, Atlantis. Thought of Scipio, Ramses II and Genghis Khan. I hope for some kind of peace, but fear that machines are several centuries ahead of morality. Only when morality has caught up will there be no more need for such destruction.